recognition or redistribution? What should be the focus of political and social philosophers? What is the fundamental aim of a theory of justice? Should it be grounded in recognition, questions and conflicts of identity? Should it be grounded in a politics of class and issues of redistribution? So in this lecture video, we're going to be looking at those kinds of questions and see to what extent then a theory of recognition in the form of the politics of difference might maybe get the relationship a bit wrong between recognition and redistribution, where Nancy Fraser is going to actually argue there's a tension between the two, which requires, rather than a theory which seeks to synthesize them, since both are relevant, rather what should be advocated is a dual theory of recognition and redistribution. So a little bit of the background, the history here. The late 19th really, and early 20th centuries, they really saw the rise of class and redistribution focused politics, where you had labor movements, socialist movements really in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and then especially by the mid 20th century, redistribution focused politics were taken up by liberalism. Think about John Rawls and the difference principle, for example, which is redistribution focused. These kinds of things were really the core of normative political philosophy, I should say. Now, what form this redistribution, took on, of course, differed. But this was the focus, even among libertarian philosophers that think about justice, right, in terms of, money, capital, goods, things like that. By the middle to late 20th century, you see a rise in what has become known as the politics of difference, right? This is where identity ended up supplanting class interests and redistribution-focused politics as the chief medium of political mobilization. You start seeing a focus on issues of nationality, ethnicity, race, gender, and sexuality, where now the political philosophies are as much social political philosophies that are really focused or grounded in issues of race and gender and so on, where class and issues of redistribution start to take a backseat. Because the idea is, well, look, these politics of redistribution, they ended up kind of covering over, right, issues of identity, issues of recognition. Now, Fraser thinks those issues that the politics of difference brings up, they are important. They cannot be overlooked, and it is a problem if redistribution-focused politics do overlook those things. But what she argues is that struggles for recognition, they occur in a world of exacerbated material inequality, so they cannot be understood then separate from this phenomenon, that it's a mistake then when politics of difference, when recognition theorists go too far, focusing on nationality, ethnicity, race, and so on. She says, material inequality in terms of income and property ownership and access to paid work, education, healthcare, and leisure time, but also more starkly in caloric intake and exposure to environmental toxicity, hence in life expectancy and rates of morbidity and mortality. Material inequality is on the rise in most of the world's countries, in the United States and in Haiti, in Sweden and in India, in Russia and in Brazil. It is also increasing globally across the line that divides north from south. Thus, for as much as we can say, look, it's important to bring a focus to issues of race and gender that have either been obfuscated or lessened, is to say, look, black people are still, of course, concerned with issues of material inequality and life expectancy and all those kinds of things, as much are trans people, as much are people in the global south and so on, right? So all the non-white, non-rich people, they are still interested in all these kinds of things that affect their lives. And so you cannot just have a theory of race, a theory of gender, a theory of sexuality and oppression that is particular to race, gender, and sexuality and so on. You can't have those theories that are separate from or not embedded in, right, material inequality. So here's the dilemma Fraser thinks political philosophers face. How should we view the eclipse of a socialist imaginary that is centered on interest, exploitation, and redistribution, when now, right, the politics of difference is instead focused on notions of identity, difference, cultural domination, and recognition? Do we say, well, the focus no longer should be interest, exploitation, and redistribution? Should we rethink what exploitation, redistribution, and interest mean? Should we have dual theories? You know, one way to interpret this new phenomena in social political movements is to say, right, from a more like what's called vulgar materialist Marxist interpretation, well, all these interests in like recognition and cultural domination, these are really issues of what's called the superstructure, and so these represent a rise in false consciousness, because they think the real problems are these cultural issues when really the real issues are material problems. Should maybe the correct interpretation be that this politics of difference represents the attempt to redress the cultural blindness of a materialist paradigm? Fraser really rejects both of these issues. I mean, she thinks, yes, to a certain extent, too much of a focus in difference, identity, and so on does represent a certain kind of false consciousness to the extent that it obfuscates then material issues, class issues. But on the other hand, it would be wrong to say that, oh, well, you know, the materialist paradigm just represents a kind of cultural blindness, as if there aren't cultural issues that are embedded in, right, the materialist paradigm that go hand in hand, as she wants to say, being a Marxist who wants to say, yes, philosophers of difference have a point, but they go too far in a certain way. So Nancy Fraser thinks that we need to develop a critical theory of recognition, but one which identifies and defends only those versions of the politics of difference that coherently synergize with the politics of redistribution. To the extent that a politics of difference is unable to synergize with a politics of redistribution, they will be unable to fundamentally address the injustices and oppressions of capitalism. So, what exactly is entailed in the politics of difference? Well, Iris Marion Young's Justice and the Politics of Difference is one of the most celebrated books of political philosophy of difference. And in that book, Young claims to offer an account of social justice that encompasses both redistribution and recognition. Now, Fraser thinks Young ends up really centering the book on recognition, that issues of redistribution are overlooked, even though she thinks her theory of oppression is able to account for, economic oppressions as well, not just like cultural identity-based oppressions. But before we get to that criticism, Young's theory of injustice, because as a critical theorist, she's theorizing from the ground up, from practice first, and in practice we are presented first with forms of injustice, and we see what those are and what that can tell us about what justice might look like then, and able to redress and overcome forms of injustice. As she says, we can understand injustice in two ways. First, injustice as domination, which is the prevention of participation in determining one's actions or conditions of one's actions, right? So this really concerns a lack of empowerment, a lack of democracy, not just in a formal political sphere, but other social economic spheres as well. And then there's oppression. Injustice occurs when one is oppressed, which means that there is institutional constraint on self-development. And this occurs in 5 different ways. This she calls the 5 phases of oppression. They are exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. Now, The first three, exploitation, marginalization, and powerlessness, have more of an economic focus, whereas the last two, cultural imperialism and violence, have more of a cultural identity based focus. What is the overall thing that really links then Jung's theory of injustice here is that rather than what she called distribution theorists, which center on the standpoint of distribution, such as, okay, we see some people have more money, some people have more goods, some people have less. And she also says, like, they also, of course, focus on things like non-material goods, like, trust and recognition they think of as a kind of distributional matter. She says, where the distributional theorists go wrong is focusing on the standpoint of distribution rather than the standpoint of production, which is to say, the standpoint of the social relations between one another, the base structure of society. Rawls refers to this as the background conditions, which really situate and condition the way in which then distribution occurs. So rather than saying, well, look, we've got all these issues of income inequality, let's then go ahead and try to say, well, how should it be redistributed? Jung wants to say, which a Marxist like Fraser says is good, we should actually ask, well, what about how distribution occurs in the first place? Is that just? So Fraser thinks Jung is onto something, and she gets some things right about where our focus should be on, which is not to say, quantitative, like to what extent then should one have more over less, but rather who has a say in how things are produced, right? How does one relate to one another? What is the kind of social hierarchy that makes up the production of society and its reproduction? Now, I already mentioned this a little bit, but Fraser says there's a bipartite character of oppression in Jung's theory. So, to focus a little more on oppression, because that is what Jung really focuses on, is oppression rather than domination, Jung says oppression consists in systematic institutional processes which prevent some people from learning and using satisfying and expansive skills in socially recognized settings, or institutional processes, which inhibit people's ability to play and communicate with others or to express their feelings and perspectives on social life in contexts where others can listen, right? And so what is really entailed then in overcoming oppression is allowing those who, just don't fit the mold and want to do things differently, can be affirmed in wanting to do that, more or less. Now, the clauses, Fraser says, that bring out the bipartite character such that there is in oppression, there's cultural oppression and political economic oppression, such that we can see in cultural recognition that there is it's a matter of expressing one's experience, and there are processes which inhibit people's ability to play and communicate with others or to express their feelings and perspectives on social life in contexts where others can listen. Right? So this theory of oppression, on the one hand, encompasses this cultural recognition. On the other hand, it is also meant to encompass issues of political economy. Right? So this theory of oppression is meant to have both at the same time. Where we can see political economic oppression as constraints on developing and exercising one's capacities, and systematic institutional processes which prevent some people from learning and using satisfying and expansive skills in socially recognized settings. So Jung thinks that this one definition of oppression can account for both cultural and political economic forms of oppression. What we're going to see in the rest of this lecture is that Fraser thinks, no, the two sides of this definition are actually not adequately integrated with one another, and they end up leaving an unresolved tension such that sometimes addressing cultural oppression would mean not addressing political economic oppression, or actually making it worse, and vice versa. The politics of difference, for Fraser, is a vision of emancipation especially suited to the situation of ethnic groups. So the politics of difference works best for ethnic groups. And this means two things. One, where the differences in question are those of ethnic cultures, justice would be best served by affirming them and thereby fostering cultural diversity. Saying, look, yes, the standard is to have your hair a certain way, to dress a certain way, to talk a certain way, listen to certain kinds of music, whatever, right? What the politics of difference would say is no, there isn't just a universal standard for, what's the best or acceptable or formal or great music, but there are different kinds of music because no one culture has a monopoly on saying what are the best ways to dress, the best ways to talk, and so on. And secondly, where cultural differences are linked to differentially desirable locations in the political economy, a politics of difference may be displaced. So on the one hand, the politics of difference is especially situated. It's good for addressing certain kinds of injustice, as I just mentioned. But it's actually bad for addressing certain kinds of political economic injustice and certain kinds of political economic oppression. If there are certain kinds of cultures that arise from hierarchical class distinctions, then that wouldn't be justified to say, no, we have to, because we have to affirm all kinds of cultural difference. Fraser wants to say, no, any kind of a cultural difference that is the result of class hierarchy, that doesn't mean we should preserve then class hierarchy. She says justice may require precisely in these cases where cultural differences are linked to differentially desirable locations in the political economy, that their justice may require precisely undermining group differentiation by, for example, restructuring the division of labor. Because a democratic division of labor then would undo those kinds of class hierarchies, which would then not affirm certain kinds of culture that arise from that class hierarchy. And so in that case, she says, a redistribution could obviate then even the need for recognition, such that sometimes redistribution could dissolve certain kinds of issues of recognition. And in those cases, it would seem that maybe a politics of redistribution is more primary, more fundamental to a politics of recognition. The remedy for culturally rooted oppressions is cultural revolution. So this means breaking down the idea of a single universal set of cultural norms and affirming cultural pluralism and difference. Those are the tactics to be employed by recognition theorists and those who engage in the politics of difference. But the principal remedy for economically rooted oppressions is not the same kind of politics. It is a radical restructuring of the division of labor. And Fraser says that this includes eliminating the division between, for example, task defining and task executing work and providing socially valued, skill enhancing activities for all. So in some cases, it actually then is a universal politics, a universal class politics, a universal materialist redistribution politics. So, and this is the really key point here, there is a potentially harmful tension between economically rooted politics and culturally rooted politics. Fraser says that whereas the remedy for the culturally rooted oppressions promotes group differentiation, the remedy for the economically rooted oppressions may end up undermining it. In some cases, consequently, the effects of the two remedies will be contradictory. So I want to look at three cases that Fraser spends more time on, looks at more closely. So the first is the case of working class non-professionals. So Fraser says, first, take the case of working class non-professionals. In Young's account, they suffer primarily the oppression of powerlessness, although presumably also that of exploitation. As a consequence, then, of powerlessness, moreover, they are said to develop a class habitus, a certain kind of cultural among blue class workers, or a certain kind of affinity among them that marks them as lacking respectability. Here, then, is an oppressed group whose existence and whose oppression are both rooted in political economy. The question, then, is the politics of difference apposite to what is required, then, in the case of working class non-professionals? And in Fraser's case, she says the answer is no. And this is because it is unlikely that an affinity group based on the shared experience of powerlessness and non-respectability would survive as a group in the event that its economic oppression were remedied via redistribution. So if we were to say, well, the fact that, blue-collar workers have less say in the conditions over their own, working lives, and they end up having less respect, culturally speaking, as compared to white-collar workers, well, the politics of difference would say, well, the fact that they constitute a distinct kind of culture as blue-class workers, that kind of culture should be affirmed. But Fraser's point is, well, if their political economic status is an injustice, then that status would need to be dissolved by rectifying that injustice such that there are no blue-collar workers anymore that have less of a say over their own working conditions, such that then they are no longer not valued or respected among the culture and the public at large. So she says, suppose, for example, that the division of labor between task-defining work and task-executing work were abolished. In that case, all jobs would encompass both sorts of work, and the class division between professionals and non-professionals would be abolished. Cultural affinities that differentiate professionals from non-professionals would probably wither away as well, since they appear to have no other basis of existence. And thus, a politics of redistribution that successfully combated the political economic oppression of powerlessness would effectively destroy the group as a group. And the destruction of that cultural group would actually then be justice. Much as Marx claimed that the task of the proletariat was to abolish itself as a class. So the politics of difference and contrast would not contribute to overcoming oppression in the case then of blue-collar workers. Instead, it would interfere with the pursuit of redistribution. Okay, a second case then, that of women as an oppressed group. Fraser says, it is doubtful to me that women really do constitute a group in Young's sense of a felt connection of shared experience or affinity. And yet gender is unquestionably a structural principle of the division of labor, and as such, it disadvantages women as a group. Let us consider, therefore, the effects of a restructured division of labor on women as an oppressed group. Let us assume, further, that a long-term feminist goal is to subvert the existing gender division of labor, right? Maybe women having less desirable jobs or getting paid less. And not merely then to elevate the standing of women within it, hence to establish a radical redistribution. Now, if the gender division of labor were effectively abolished, would gender-distinct cultural affinities survive? And if not, is the politics of difference an appropriate remedy then for the oppression of women? So she admits that this case seems less clear-cut than the previous one. Gender affinities, if indeed they exist, could have additional bases beyond their basis in the division of labor, no doubt. For example, in socialization, in culture, even in bodily experiences such as menstruation. Thus, even a successful politics of redistribution might not abolish women then as a group, as in the case of class it would abolish itself as a class. Women could still be culturally constructed as different from men and be denigrated and oppressed on that basis, even if a politics of redistribution redresses their economic injustices. Thus, a politics of difference could be in order here to redress issues of gender injustice. But this raises a further dilemma, Fraser thinks. The struggle to remedy women's cultural oppression by affirming women's difference on the model of ethnicity might militate against the struggle to abolish the gender division of labor, which entails decreasing the social salience of gender. The first, after all, calls attention to and exaggerates if it does not performatively create gender difference. The second, in contrast, would minimize such difference, if not abolish it altogether. The final case, that of African Americans. Fraser says that this case seems different yet again. There's little reason to think that abolishing the racial division of labor would entail the disappearance of the affinity group, since that group has an independent cultural basis, similar to the case of women. A more likely result would be the transformation of a subordinate racialized caste into an ethnic group, such that then, in terms of class, they're the same with others, and yet distinct ethnically. And this would be historically new, Fraser says, since African Americans, like Native Americans, have never been allowed to be just another ethnic group. What these examples show, I think, she says, is that disadvantaged social collectivities differ from one another importantly, both in their bases of differentiation and also in the roots of their oppression. In some cases, political economic restructuring seems certain to entail group de-differentiation, such that groups then shouldn't be different anymore. Cases of political economic problems, political economic injustices. While in others, it clearly does not. In still other cases, by contrast, the implications are harder to predict. If this is right, Fraser says, then the politics of difference is not globally applicable. You can't have just a kind of universal politics of difference. You can't just say, well, the politics of difference then can be unique in each particular situation, because in some situations they might actually make worse certain forms of political economic injustices. In some cases, such as that as non-professional workers, it is simply a skew of the nature of the group and its oppression. It can't adequately understand it. In other cases, in contrast, such as gays and lesbians, the politics of difference is absolutely crucial for remedying oppression. The hardest cases, of course, Fraser thinks, are those such as gender and race, in which both redistribution and recognition are required to overcome a complex of oppression that is multiple and multiply rooted. The difficulty there stems from the real tensions and interferences that arise when one tries to both affirm and to abolish difference simultaneously. Both affirm difference as a distinct ethnic group involving distinct cultural experiences and histories, and yet trying to abolish the difference in terms of class. A glib and global endorsement of the politics of difference, Fraser thinks, won't help us solve this problem. Because for that, we need to face the problem squarely and to develop a critical theory of recognition. And for Fraser, that means a theory of recognition which synthesizes as best as possible with a politics of redistribution. There can be no theory of recognition without a politics of redistribution, since, Fraser, being a Marxist, capitalism is the fundamental social economic order of society. Okay. So Fraser thinks this means, rather than Young's simple dichotomy between an affirmationist philosophy of difference, which says, no, we need to, not affirmationist, sorry, an assimilationist, where the assimilationist says we need to kind of assimilate everyone and assimilate all kinds of differences into one universal culture. Young said, no, we need to instead promote a politics with difference, which says there are different kinds of culture, different kinds of experience that need to be affirmed, each on their own basis. But Fraser says we can actually have 4 possible attitudes towards difference rather than 2. The first attitude towards difference is what she calls humanism, which says the differences that members of oppressed groups evince are precisely the damages of oppression or the lies that rationalize them. So you can say the certain kinds of differences that members of oppressed groups evince could be certain kinds of stereotypes or even cultural practices that are the result of oppression. second kind of attitude towards difference, that of cultural nationalism. She says, the differences that members of oppressed groups evince here are marks of their cultural superiority over their oppressors, where in some cases, certain kinds of habits, certain kinds of practices, certain kinds of institutions that are unique to minority groups are unique and in some cases better than what is the dominant cultural institutions of, as she says, their oppressors. The third possible attitude towards difference, that of cultural variation. So Fraser says here, differences are manifested by members of different groups that are neither superiorities nor inferiorities. They're simply variations that are to be affirmed each on their own basis. So neither cultural practice or institution is necessarily better than the other in this case. You could think of certain kinds of music, right? Rap versus rock versus country or jazz or so on, right? They're simply different variations to be celebrated, each in their own right. And then 4, there are different kinds of differences. So what exactly does that mean? So Fraser says some differences are of type 1, which is of the humanism, and they should be eliminated. So any kind of difference that is the result of oppression, of a history of oppression, Fraser says that difference should be eliminated. There are differences of type 2, cultural nationalism, and these should be universalized such that if there is a certain cultural practice or institution that is superior to other cultural practices or institutions, the superior ones should become the dominant norm for all ethnic, sexual, racial groups. And then there are others of type 3, right, that of cultural variation, and those should just simply be enjoyed, as I said in the case of music. This position implies then, she says, that we can make judgments about which differences fall into which categories, and it also implies that we can make normative judgments about the relative value of alternative norms, practices, and interpretations, judgments which could lead to conclusions of inferiority, superiority, and equivalent value. Right? So we can actually make normative judgments about certain kinds of cultural practices. Sometimes we shouldn't make those normative judgments in the case of cultural variation, but other times we should, either praising in the case of cultural nationalism or condemning in the case of the humanist approach. She says that this approach militates against any politics of difference that is wholesale and undifferentiated. Put differently, it entails a different and differentiated politics of difference. Such a differentiated view of difference would be an important contribution to a critical theory of recognition. It would help us to identify and defend only those versions of the politics of difference that coherently synergize with the politics of redistribution. Because you could say, no, we don't need to simply affirm all kinds of identity. We don't need to simply affirm all kinds of cultural practices. If there are certain kinds of cultural practices that are the result of oppression, in the case of, for example, certain kinds of cultures that are the result of class, no, we need to abolish class distinction, and that would mean then getting rid of those kinds of culture that are the result of class distinction. On the other hand, though, you can celebrate and affirm other kinds of differences that aren't based on historical instances of oppression. So a few conclusions. Fraser thinks there is no neat theoretical move to dissolve or resolve the redistribution recognition dilemma. There is no simple theory that can just account for both. But that doesn't mean that we have to choose then between a politics of recognition or a politics of redistribution. Instead, Fraser argues for an integrative approach, what she calls a dual system theory that encompasses the best aspects of both. She says the task is to integrate the egalitarian ideals of the socialist paradigm with its more universalist class approach and class politics with whatever is genuinely emancipatory in the paradigm of recognition. And she says whatever is genuinely emancipatory because there are many kinds of instances of the politics of difference that are not genuinely emancipatory. So in her essay, From Redistribution to Recognition, she gives a graph And she says there are certain kinds of redistribution and recognition that are based on what she calls affirmational approaches, which are not genuinely emancipatory. Only those which are transformational are genuinely emancipatory and should be pursued. So she thinks the affirmative approach of redistribution with the liberal welfare state is the wrong approach, because this basically operates on the surface, focusing on reallocations of existing goods to existing groups that doesn't really question the fundamental structure of the political economic background conditions of our society. It supports group differentiation, and yes, it can generate actually then misrecognition, not being able to account for certain kinds of injustices. She also thinks mainstream multiculturalism is wrong, that it basically, again, it operates on the surface, focusing on certain kinds of reallocations of respect to existing identities of existing groups, which basically says, think of all those examples of some big company that says, look, we have a woman on our board now, or a woman is our CEO, or like, look, we have a black person now, that's our CEO, right? Like, look how just we are, right? How they virtue signal. And Fraser is saying, like, those aren't real emancipatory approaches to a politics of difference. Those are an approach to a politics of difference which ends up really leaving the status quo intact. Or take, the other case, right? You can have a certain approach to a politics of redistribution, which says, well, we should just tax the rich more to, fund more social goods, which, Fraser's not going to say we shouldn't do that. But if you only tax the rich and don't get at the root cause of the undemocratic structure of our economic system of production, then you're really just putting a Band-Aid on a wound and not addressing the cause of the wound itself. What you need is a transformational politics of redistribution and a transformational politics of recognition. So the transformational politics of redistribution, Fraser says, we can call socialism, which is a deep restructuring of relations of production, where this blurs group differentiation and it can help remedy some forms of misrecognition. Transformational recognition, then, would be what she calls deconstruction, where you have a deep restructuring of relations of recognition and blurs group differentiation when there are instances of oppression. I think, looking back at this essay, which is almost 30 years old, I think this really is timely to think about again, these questions of recognition and redistribution and to what extent they're compatible, whether you can have just a single theory which accounts for both instances of oppression, whether one should be favored over the other. Because if you look at this recent 2024 election, many people see the politics of difference as being rejected in the case of Trump winning. You had Trump in 2016 running on kind of a politics of redistribution, saying, look, all your jobs were offshored. I'm going to bring back these jobs. You had what was seen by many people in the case of Hillary Clinton's campaign as a politics of difference focused campaign, because it was about her becoming the first female president, and that was kind of the big thing about why you should elect her, so a woman could finally be president. Then you had Bernie Sanders running in 2016, who was saying, the 99% against the 1%. The problem is, the millionaires and billionaires. Of course, Bernie didn't win out in the Democratic nomination. And then you have, in 2024, what many see as Trump coming back as a rejection of, certain forms of identity politics. So I think we can ask the question philosophically, right, in terms of like our fundamental principles of normative political philosophy, how we should think about justice and what justice entails. Does it primarily concern redistribution, recognition, or a combination of the two, right? Is one more fundamental than the other? But we can also think about this, I think, in terms of our contemporary politics and what we're experiencing now and how that might inform us think about these questions of justice concerning recognition and redistribution.